15. The Conquest of the Temple. One morning, I woke up sweaty and in a terrible mood. I had to go to Los Robles, the rustic, wooded subdivision where I had built a cabin and planted fruit trees. The place was strange and full of threatening vibes. I showered, packed a sleeping bag and groceries into my car, plugged in a portable recorder, and hit the road at full speed while listening to Carmina Burana on headphones. I was desperate and completely off-center. I felt like my life was a failure. I was alone, and, to top it all off, subservient to the women from the ministry. The Popocatépetl volcano appeared around a curve. Its snow-capped peak impressed me. There was an interesting effect of zooming in when the slopes next to the path framed it, and another of zooming out when the references around it disappeared. I thought for a moment that this illusion also occurred in life, and the fault lay in distancing oneself from oneself, because that reference point gave meaning to everything else. I took the turn and suddenly realized I was going too fast. Instinctively, I pressed the brake pedal, and the car lurched. I swerved, braked again, and completely lost control. The car spun from side to side as I desperately held the wheel. I knew I could do nothing. The force of unbridled nature had taken over. The car crossed into the other lane, spun around twice, while I, inside its metallic structure, watched in amazement as the windshield shattered and glass flew in all directions. After the spins, I fell into an abyss and landed slowly on some bushes that cushioned my fall. There was no sound around me, and through the gap left by the windshield, tiny blades of grass began to descend on me. It looked like a silver rain from another world. I felt no pain, and the previous anguish and despair had transformed into a feeling of extreme peace. I remained motionless, not knowing if I was alive. I remembered that after the earthquake of September 19th, I had gone to teach a relaxation workshop to a group of boys from a school that had been completely destroyed. They told me that when they saw the walls beginning to fall, they all threw themselves under the benches. The roof had collapsed with a great crash, and a cloud of white dust covered them, obscuring the smallest detail. In the midst of the confusion and terror, a teenager had shouted, "Hold on, we're already dying and we're in heaven among the clouds." I felt my body for wounds and found nothing but a scratch on my forehead and a small cut on my finger. I got out of the car as best I could, picked up my sleeping bag, and on the road, I asked a man for help who took me to Mexico City. I felt like a newborn and thanked God. Everything was new, and the man driving me couldn't believe what had happened to me. I remembered that years before, a similar death-like experience had befallen me on a lonely beach on the Baja California peninsula. I had decided to isolate myself from the world, and a small Brasilia had accompanied me on the adventure. I had removed the seats and transformed its interior into a small room with a bed and several shelves for storing food. I found the beach and spent 7 days meditating inside my homemade camper. In the mornings I went snorkeling, observing magnificent fish of all colors and sizes. On the 7th day, the sky began to cloud over, and a humid wind began to blow. After so much meditation, the spectacle filled me with enormous joy. I went for a walk on the beach and found some enormous rock formations filled with giant crabs which clung tightly to the rocks and resisted the storm and the pounding waves. I approached the crustaceans and decided to imitate them. I climbed onto a rock and hugged it tightly with my arms. I didn't have time for more. A powerful wave crashed down on me, and I was thrown into the air. In the few seconds of my forced flight, I knew that if my head hit a rock, I would die. I fell, dragged by the current, which tossed me around and made me thump several times until I was deposited on the beach. My body was covered in cuts from which blood was oozing, but my head was intact. I dragged myself to the Brasilia and lay down on my cot. I remained motionless for 3 days, and when I was able to drive, I left there. The moment one faces death, faith is tested. Mine seemed intense despite all my complaints against life. But I don't know if I could have withstood what another survivor of the September earthquake told me. He was a young man who lived on the 10th floor of a building that collapsed. He was sleeping in his bed when the movement and the sounds of destruction woke him up. He felt as if he were riding in an elevator descending at a terrifying speed. Instinctively, he got under his bed after placing some weights on the ends. Everything collapsed on him, and he was crushed between the floor and the base of the bed for 14 days. When he felt himself losing consciousness, he resisted because he knew he would die. The army rescued him, still conscious. I ran into him at another relaxation workshop, amazed by everything he saw. He told me that everything was new and wonderful, and that he thanked God for his new vision of the world. Perhaps there are people who die and are reborn in the same life, like the old man with green eyes or that same boy. Don Juan confessed to Castaneda a similar experience, adding that from then on, the only ones he could talk to were those who had died and been reborn like him. What is clear is that the notion of reincarnation can be applied to a life because in it we die and are resurrected countless times. Life is a kind of mosaic into which the necessary pieces fit together to compose themes. The richness of its colors, shapes, and patterns depend on the number of structures we can transcend and the number of repetitions necessary to realize our false identities. Nothing happens by chance. In my encounters with Castaneda, he had defended the external world as broader and more mysterious than the internal one. I had been shocked by this statement, but later understood that what he had meant was that by leaving behind restricted identities and neurotic repetitions, the infinite mystery of life appears, offering endless lessons. Throughout my life, my Jewish heritage and my mother's illness had taught me to be defensive, making me consider the external world illusory. My repudiation of concrete reality had been strengthened by my studies of Buddhism and its conception of sunyata, or emptiness, that is, the non-existence of an absolute identity of objects and beings. Such conceptions reinforced my personal history, which had shown me the need to take refuge within myself. Accepting the world and its emotions meant feeling my mother's mutilation, and experiencing it meant going mad. Every time I lost my defenses, I was assaulted by what I repressed. Plunging into that madness I had to avoid at all costs. That's why I denied women, and that's also why I lost myself in the feminine domain. Since the earthquake and my work with Teresa and her team, I had begun to accept. My own mind had also helped me, using highly sophisticated means, helping me understand, at the same time, why the study of neurophysiology had been so definitive and fascinating for me. In my research on the brain, I had reached two conclusions. On the one hand, the existence of a coding mode based on convergent circuits and their inclusive analysis. This mode, which I no longer dare to consider internal, is actually so. The activity that allows one to explore it is to close one's eyes and meditate, traveling in a world full of abstractions and far from objects. All my early experiences during meditation and experimentation with its techniques were part of a decision to favor the validity of the internal world. On the other hand, behind the conception of the neural field as a means to explain the creation of experience, there was a healthy desire to validate and understand what is responsible for the perception of objects, that is, the external world. Synergistic theory affirms that the experience resulting from the interaction of the neural field and the lattice of space-time had finally destroyed the external-internal dichotomy. Unwittingly, and as a result of an exemplary dialectical process, the balance had tipped toward unification as something broader and more interesting. I knew something within me about the vastness of reality and the danger of denying it by defending any exaggerated internal or concrete external position. However, it became increasingly clear that what was important wasn't what was external or internal, but rather the ability to be in touch with the witness of both, my true nature, which transcended the world of objects, thoughts, and any abstract process. In a conversation with Teresa, we recalled a lecture in which the Buddhist desire for interiorization had been contrasted with the Christian dictum of loving one's neighbor as a means to achieving enlightenment. In reality, it was the same argument between Hinayana Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, the former defending solitude and self-absorption, and the latter denying it to propose, instead, the bodhisattva path of love and compassion for others. In myself, both conceptions had been physiologically debated, like the circuits of convergence and algorithmization of the neuronal field. Now, I was no longer affected by the reality of that debate, but by who in me was proposing and observing it. The fascination with such topics was explained in the same way any fascination in life is understood, that is, motivated by the search for a necessary piece for the mosaic, a piece that, in the attempt to find it, is intuited as potentially delicious, motivating exploration. A piece that, when found and placed in its proper place within the mosaic of life, ceases to provoke desire and becomes a conquest that serves as a catapult to undertake other searches. I had to understand the existence of the world in order to accept and love it. Validating it was equivalent to being able to explain it, and the neural field and the lattice were the means. At first, I had believed that what I was doing was demonstrating that the brain was not necessary, that is, I was trying not to confront the maternal illness. If the interaction between the neural field and the lattice explained the experience, and the central processor explained the awareness of it, then the organic brain could take a back seat. In reality, such an interpretation had been bequeathed to me by my psychoanalysis, which had thus demonstrated the existence of its own limits. In truth, what I was attempting was more sophisticated. It was the path to accepting myself without denial and with all my doubts and contradictions. The world I was trying to understand was that of my immediate perception, and this had become individualized to the point of no longer corresponding to the usual one. In this sense, P had been responsible. From my relationship with her, what I felt as immediate was the experience of constantly living in a kind of invisible ocean, in which the unmanifested emotions and thoughts of others were inscribed. I felt the mysterious reverberation of neuronal fields and the complicated web resulting from their interactions. I called this invisible ocean the hyperfield, thus reconciling myself with Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere. Without realizing it, I was changing bodies. I had managed to find myself, and now I was seeking others. I had begun to shed my individual self and long to understand the collective. Once again, Castaneda came to my aid. For Don Juan, consciousness existed in the emanations themselves, so their alignment only served to focus a kind of pre-existing, immanent consciousness in everything. For me, it began to feel the same. Consciousness existed before matter, and the interaction between the neural field and the lattice activated a conscious pattern of extreme complexity. Therefore, the central processor was unnecessary. I remembered that in a conversation with Goenka, after explaining the Sintergic Theory to him, he had told me that he agreed with everything, but that the interaction of the neural field and the lattice was enough to explain the perception of the world. The image sees itself, he affirmed, looking at me with deep, brilliant eyes. Donna Maria Matus, in the Yaqui territory of Sonora, had told me that everything was conscience, but that God was the one who granted it. Don Panchito affirmed the same thing. Therefore, the hyperfield was also a consciousness, but even more complex than any individual neural field. During a stay in the mountains of Puebla at an indigenous shelter, I began writing a new book titled Psychophysiology of Power. In it, I concluded that the hyperfield must have a direction of development and a modulator, an omega point toward which it was heading. I called it the strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield. The strange attractor of an individual neuronal field is the master player of its main theme. The strange attractor of the hyperfield is its ideal future, which directs the fulfillment of a stage in its ordering and development. In mid-1987, I was invited to Cuba to present my research results at the Inter-American Congress of Psychology. I invited Astucia to accompany me and presented a study of the electrophysiological basis of communication and indigenous Mexican psychology. Both studies offered foundations for the Sintergic Theory, the interaction between neuronal fields, and the existence of the hyperfield. Astucia didn't like Cuba because of its passive atmosphere and its impression of time standing still. It gave me peace and silence. In Havana, I met with some transpersonal psychologists who informed me about a planetary convergence phenomenon that would occur between August 16 and 17. They suggested I be in Palenque around that time. In Pátzcuaro, during the week ending August 16, I assisted with a training course for the counselors in charge of the Self-Management Motivation Program for indigenous shelters, the same program I coordinated to improve the conditions of the country's indigenous children. I learned that this date marked the beginning of a new era in which, according to tradition, the influence of Tezcatlipoca would begin to wane and that of Quetzalcoatl would increase. On August 16th, a tornado appeared behind Lake Pátzcuaro, moving like a serpent, emerging from the clouds and heading toward the earth. I imagined it was a sign of the descent of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. That same day, I completed the Psychophysiology of Power and traveled to Palenque. I saw omens in everything, and as I ascended the observatory tower amidst the pyramids of Palenque, I felt like I was performing an initiatory act. I sat at a stone table in the upper chamber of the tower and felt the wind penetrating through the 4 windows set in its stone walls. My mind traveled back in time, and I knew that there sat the great Mayan priest dedicated to balancing the hyperfield of his time. The wind brought him news of events, and depending on its intensity and direction, he knew the dynamics of the collective spirit. It allowed itself to be permeated by the winds, nourishing them with its own consciousness. It had to be impeccable and pure to be able to adjust the appropriate direction of development and thus guide the hyperfield toward the strange attractor of its ideal future. I realized that at a certain level of development, the difference between the individual neuronal field and the hyperfield had to disappear until they became one and the same. I wondered if something similar could be achieved in contemporary Mexico and tried to understand its hyperfield, its strange attractor, and its ideal future. I've spent the last few months trying to answer these questions, searching for clues and signs in everything I see and everything that happens. I've hesitated for a long time to include the following pages. Perhaps I should leave this recap here because what follows hasn't had time to mature and develop, and because I don't yet feel capable of letting go of all my projections. One that concerns me greatly is that of the paternal figure. I know I've desperately sought it out in all my teachers, And I also recognize that I still harbor a great deal of resentment toward what it represents. That doesn't stop me from loving it as well. I believe that in this regard, I am very Mexican because I recognize the same mix of emotions in my fellow countrymen. Despite being part of the first generation born in Mexico, or perhaps because of it, the similarity astonishes me. If the shamans are right, both a country and the planet have consciousness, and this consciousness is alive and affects all its inhabitants, bathing them with its presence. Therefore, being born in Mexico necessarily meant being subject to its influence. The Mexican government seemed to be in the same boat. They act as surrogate fathers and are hated and loved, the latter less and less, as symbols of an undeveloped projection. The dynamics and transformations of this projection explain much of what's happening. I believe that, like me, the entire country and its inhabitants are entering a phase of maturity regarding the individual and collective paternal figure. With these warnings intended to absolve me of blame for the mistakes I will surely make, I continue. The crisis Mexico is experiencing represents, for me, a process of gestation for a rebirth. In some ways, the development model the country has sought to imitate is proving inadequate and is in its final stages. This model is based on an emphasis on materialistic and economic values, on the belief that material goods, technological capacity, and industrial growth are the parameters and means to achieve happiness. Mexico's hyperfield seems to disagree with such ideas and unwilling to incorporate them into its true essence. It seems to say that its destiny is to fulfill other types of goals that are more dear to it and for which it possesses the energy, motivation, and capacity for fascination. The Mexican hyperfield must feel frustrated at not finding leaders worthy of its ideal future. It must feel dejected by the foolishness of those who claim to guide it, when what's really happening is that they distort it, creating a tension within it that, if it reaches a threshold, will cause it to explode. However, its hyperfield is very stable, and before that happens, its strange attractor will try every alternative that will allow it to throw off the yoke and acquire fluidity to fulfill its destiny. Just as there is no chance in the development of human life, there is no chance in the evolution of the hyperfield. I feel a battle is being waged that will cause greater or lesser suffering depending on our ability to understand our destiny and the direction in which we should focus our efforts. If that direction corresponds to the strange attractor of our hyperfield's ideal future, we will receive all kinds of help from it and flow unhindered toward what Mexico truly is. If this is not the case, we, as a collective consciousness, will have to suffer so many neurotic repetitions of false identities until we are able to transcend them and find ourselves in what we truly are. But even if we are unable to understand what is happening, the transformation process has already begun. When a baby is born, the baby's parents and society are responsible for establishing the position of its reality. In Don Juan's nomenclature, they establish the position of its assemblage point. To do so, they use their own fixedness as a model. The social structure, the school system, and the values of the community help the infant structure a world and stabilize it until they identify with it. From that moment on, the possibility of experiencing other realities is restricted and eventually blocked. It is a mechanism designed to sustain the prevailing social structure and prevent its disintegration. The often infamous price of denying creativity or the exploration of different possibilities for existence is paid with stability. An event must occur that challenges the fixed position of reality for it to agree to transform. This event, to be effective, must be capable of breaking down all defenses to allow movement, and with it the experience of a richer and more satisfying reality than the one previously considered unique. It is a kind of blessing that must be seized upon and understood as such. If it is not recognized, the movement of the assemblage point reverses and returns to its original position. Individual consciousness is a model of collective consciousness, and the organic body and neuronal field are models of the hypercampal body and the hyperfield itself. Therefore, there is also a vocalizer of global consciousness, called the collective assemblage point or hippocampus. In the case of Mexico, its hippocampal assemblage point abandoned the fixed position it had held until the events of 1968 caused it to oscillate. The decision that motivated the Tlatelolco massacre was a desperate attempt to fix it again in its previous position, but the movement had already begun, and the memory of having experienced an alternative reality was enough to initiate a transformation. The earthquakes of 1985 again modified the position of the hypercampal assemblage point. The reality that was brought into focus demonstrated the existence of a more authentic and valuable parameter associated with a caring and loving state of being, which manifested when the government's fixed controls temporarily cracked, allowing a more genuine nature to emerge. The attempts to return it to its previous position failed because the country was experiencing a crisis for which the responsibility lay precisely in that crisis. From that moment on, an oscillatory movement of the hypercampal assemblage point began, focusing on alternative realities that were impossible to foresee and control. The fixity was lost, and the strategic plan of the strange attractor frontally attacked the awareness of the material and economic as an absolute and reliable value. Subsequently, and as a consequence of the above, it called into question the system of government's real capacity to guide toward what should be its primary function, the achievement of happiness and the fulfillment of individual and collective consciousness. An organized opposition and respected leaders emerged, shattering the paternal image of the government and warning the population about its corruption. If I'm not mistaken, everything superfluous and false will ultimately fail to withstand the questioning resulting from the oscillations of the hypercampal assemblage point. Only that which transcends them will end up being the only reliable parameter, and on it, the new position will be fixed. No identity that does not correspond to the essential will prosper. We must be able to discover who we are, what nourishes us and brings us true happiness. If we succeed, we will flourish with all the power worthy of our true nature. Only then will we be worthy of conquering the temple. Stories: The Fish and the Bird. A goldfish was amazed by the flight of birds. He liked to look up at the surface of the water and watch the swallow move across the open space by flapping its wings. He loved analyzing its movements and thinking that they allowed it to reach great speeds. He understood the mechanism of flight, and he wanted to fly. A swallow was amazed by the fish swimming. He liked to fly over the pond to see how the goldfish, moving its tail, moved in the clear, cool water. He loved analyzing the way the fish floated, motionless and effortless, and how it changed position in a flash. He understood the mechanics of swimming, and he wanted to swim. One sunny day, the swallow spoke to the fish. "If you teach me to swim, I'll teach you to fly." And the fish answered him with a smile, "Deal." From that moment on, they became friends. The fish explained to the swallow all the secrets of swimming, and taught him how to fold his wings and move in such a way that would allow him to penetrate the water and move around in it. The swallow, in turn, taught the fish how to gain enough momentum in an upward movement from the depths of the pond. He explained that this push would make him leave the water and that, once in space, he would have to move his tail and thus be able to fly. The learning process was slow and dangerous, But the time came when all the movements were learned, and it was decided to take the final test. The swallow, anxious, said to the fish, "You're ready to fly, now you must try." And the fish, worried, replied, "You are too, if you want you can swim." The two of them prepared themselves, taking a deep breath, and after a moment of hesitation they dared. Someone, at the edge of the pond, had a fantastic vision. He saw a goldfish fly and a swallow swim. When they met again, they both noticed that each had a special sparkle in their eyes, a deep and serene reflection. The fish looked at his companion and said, "When I was flying, I made a discovery. I felt I could know you in ways I'd never imagined. I lived my flight being you and me." The swallow, blushing, answered, "I felt the same." The fish, frowning, looked at a leaf floating in the pond. It seemed to want to say something very difficult or painful. The swallow demanded of it, "Say it at once." "I also discovered something else. I knew that my swimming was no different from your flight. I felt that I had swum like an automaton before, and that I had forgotten that swimming is also beautiful. Besides..." The fish didn't dare finish. He looked in one direction and then in the other, avoiding meeting the swallow's gaze. The swallow waited thoughtfully. Finally, the fish continued, "Besides, I understood the reason for forgetting. I only saw your flight and wanted to be like you. I thought that mine could not be as beautiful as yours. Now I know that both are." The swallow smiled, approached the fish, and embracing it, confided, "We've both learned the same thing. Nothing from this moment on will be the same. My flight will be the most wonderful, and your swimming too. You will be in me, and I will be in you, but we will both be what we are, and nothing will be better, or can teach us more." They say that from that day on, something strange happened near the pond. A goldfish was learning to swim and a swallow to fly. The bee and its honeycomb. A silvery moving surface filled with stars. A hot, humid vapor rising from the fresh air. A sunny day and a lake. A red volume with an excited center. Erect sensual pistils, expectant of pollen. A flower. A changing, harmonious and pure sound. A song of life, virile and delicate, intense and naive. A nightingale. A honeycomb. Dark, cold, mathematical, orderly. BX38 inside, licking the cells, taking care of their cleanliness, obsessive, methodical in its movements, determined and structured, imprisoned. A sun, a lake, a flower, and a nightingale. Outside, order, rigidity, structure, and agreement. Inside. One day something happened in the honeycomb. A loaf of wax came loose from its mooring, and when it fell, it cracked one of the walls. BX38, distraught and panicking, rushed to the scene of the catastrophe. Light was entering through the crack, a dazzling warm trickle, and also fresh air laced with mountain steam. BX38 couldn't stand it. Nothing exists outside the honeycomb. Those were the teachings. No one exists outside the geometry and the perfect structure of the cells. That was the order. X38 fixed the crack, placed the wax in its proper place, and went to rest. She didn't want to remember. A warm golden trickle and a fresh mountain scent. But the vision kept coming back, and a very faint, timid thought began to be heard. There are things you don't know. Not everything is the structure. There is something out there. The next morning, BX38 approached the scene of the accident. She touched the arrangement made the previous day with her antennae, trying to find any spots that hadn't been sealed, but she found no errors. A divine thought. Very well, they'll congratulate you on the arrangement. You can feel proud. The bee felt bewildered before. The thought would have given him maximum security, but now he couldn't feel completely happy, he said to himself. Already calmer, she went to clean, tidy, and build cells. The bees at her side did the same, then everything was fine, fixed and safe. 3 days later, a sound pierced the airtight walls of the honeycomb. It was a sweet, harmonious song. The workers looked at each other. They needed to thicken the walls so that no sound would interrupt their work. BX38 felt an intense desire to continue listening, but since all her companions thought it was important to thicken the walls, she went to help them. It was a strange feeling. X38 didn't thicken the walls like her companions, she saw herself doing it. A bee cannot think about itself, much less see itself. Something strange was happening. There was light and heat and smell and singing. The next morning the search began. BX38 had disappeared. There would have been no problem if the disappearance had been the result of an accident. If X38 had been killed or kidnapped, no one would have worried, but the disappearance had not been accidental. X38 had been caught leaving the hive on its own wings. Such an affront and such a betrayal had never been seen before. It was necessary to find her so that she would be convinced that the hive was the only thing that existed, that everything else was a fantasy and a danger. BX38 was admiring the lake. She had never felt so happy. She felt the freshness of the water, smelled the deliciousness of the flowers, and sang with the nightingale. There was no time for anything else. Janios and Or was a very mature chief and had never allowed panic to spread among his people, and he wasn't about to start doing so now. It was true that the glare, the terrible noise, and the heat had managed to disrupt his characteristic state of serenity and the tranquility he had managed to maintain in his domain for more than 20 years. But all that was over, and now the only important thing was to rebuild the destroyed huts and put out the fires. The assembly of elders, gathered in the ceremonial cave, demanded explanations. What had caused the appearance of the light, the tidal wave, the heat? Why had the sea changed color? Why, if or had said everything had changed color? Why, if or had said everything was over, did the dead fish continue to appear and the ash continue to fall from the sky? Or didn't know, he let the elders know, but he also expressed his disappointment at noting that they hadn't learned that the world was far more mysterious and wonderful than any structure that purported to explain it. The elders understood, and within each of them grew the certainty that Or was still the teacher and leader, for he was the one who made them learn. The next morning, the news was spread throughout the village. 2 human bodies had been found near the reef. One of them had severe burns all over his body and appeared to have died. The other was still breathing, although very weakly. Or gave orders to take the survivor to the village's largest hut, where he would receive proper care. Or's greatest pride was his meetings with the children. Every morning all the village children came to Or's house, and for 4 hours they discussed their dreams, did imagination exercises, and talked about what they had learned the previous day, or told them that he had dreamed of his deceased father, who in his dream had pointed out the fruit of a tree and taking it in his hand had examined it carefully while eating it. This, Or told them, means that real knowledge is based on 2 processes. One of them is knowing, and the other is feeling. He revealed to them that in the dream his father had indicated this to him by taking the fruit, observing it, and eating it. Someone who knows, he said, is capable of understanding what surrounds them by observing the relationships between the observable, without at the same time ceasing to feel them. The children nodded delightedly. One of them mentioned that the day before he had experienced something similar to Or's dream. While making love with his little friend, he had understood that someone who knows things without being able to feel them truly doesn't know them. In the same way, someone who feels things but doesn't understand them doesn't know them. This is why true wisdom only exists when one understands and feels them. A little girl said that she had understood that feeling had no limits. that they appeared when one becomes entrenched in a routine pattern and when one is a spectator of oneself. She had seen a flower. It was beautiful, and upon observing it, she had felt that she loved it. This sensation had become so intense that it began to frighten her. At that moment, he stopped loving her, which showed that the feeling of love existed until the moment he began to think about the intensity of his feeling. Therefore, he would have continued if fear hadn't appeared, or thought it was wonderful to learn from children. What they said was the most profound and real. For awe, the day was highly stimulating. After the meeting with the children, he discussed philosophical issues with the elders. Today they would talk about certainty and its relationship to knowledge. After the discussion, or plan to visit the survivor, what had happened? The elders were right to be worried. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Or thought that, even if it was the worst, it shouldn't affect him, although he couldn't help feeling curious and worried. The survivor probably knew how his body hurt. Every movement represented a gigantic effort. He probably had some fractures, and surely first and second degree burns. Janios tried to open his eyes. The light was scorching, and also that strange smell, a mixture of sweat, smoke, wet straw, and urine. He began to remember. The view from the astronomical balloon was spectacular. The sea showed an intense color, the atmosphere was clear, and not a single cloud could be seen. His companion was busy with the barometer when the radio transmission reached them. They only managed to hear the gasping and desperation of the operator, and now those pains and the unpleasant smell. Or watched Janios, guessed his suffering, and felt his desperate effort to open his eyes. His body was muscular. The wrinkles on his face indicated a person of strong character and decisiveness. Or couldn't say for sure, but he felt he would learn many things from the wounded man. Janios was amazed at Or's stature. He was a true giant. The look on that Goliath's face was strange. There was a phosphorescent glow in his eyes, and his expression was philosophical, although his clothing suggested he was a primitive man, perhaps a member of a tribe that had not come into contact with civilization. Or asked him his name, and Janios's reply was a mixture of guttural sounds and high-pitched tones. They would have to teach him their language, otherwise they wouldn't be able to communicate. Or asked two of her children to teach the man how to speak. The meeting with the elders took place 6 months later. Janios had fully recovered, and his knowledge of the native language was sufficient to communicate easily with them. The meeting had been Janios's own idea. The last 2 months he'd seemed desperate and upset. Everything he saw seemed to put him in a mood very close to a bad mood. The few times he spoke, he mentioned his disagreement with his surroundings, and explained that many mistakes were being made in the way children were raised, in the way they communicated, and even in the way they made love, right there in plain sight. When Janios spoke, everyone listened and smiled, but no one seemed to take him very seriously. The elders settled down to listen to Janios, or had asked them to be considerate, and not to forget that Janios had a history and inner experiences very different from those they shared. Janios began by thanking everyone for their attention and kindness, or noticed the confusion among his people. It was absurd for anyone to be grateful. It was true that Janios came from a very remote place, but his primitivism was exaggerated. Janios began to explain that in his hometown he was considered an authority for his knowledge and command of science. It was inconceivable, or himself began to get worried. His children understood from the age of 4 that boasting about having knowledge only meant that it does not exist except as data, and here was an apparently adult person who had not passed the age of 4. An elder began to speak, and Janios asked to be allowed to finish. This remark provoked such laughter among the council members that Or was forced to intervene. He made a sign that meant, "Be patient," and the elders, smiling, understood. Janios didn't understand what was happening. He'd never imagined such a normal request could cause such a scandal. The tribe was truly very primitive. He took a breath, smoothed his hair, and continued. The science academies of 7 countries have named me an honorary member in recognition of my work. I'm telling you all this so you understand and don't misinterpret what I wish to tell you. Or he felt dizzy. Asking the council of elders for understanding only meant being questioned a priori. It was the ultimate insecurity and distrust. Mentioning the possibility of misinterpretation only meant they were dealing with a person who had learned nothing in his life, and who had been born and raised in a society in full decline. The elders looked at each other, all of them feeling deeply sorry. Janios was sure that the reaction he saw was a sign that they had begun to respect him. He felt calmer and continued. I have noticed a number of errors in the way you are organized and, above all, in how you educate the children. Believe me, the only reason I am sharing all these observations with you is the desire to help you. Or, with an ironic tone that deeply surprised the elders, asked Janios to be a little more specific. Precisely with that in mind, Janios replied, I'll allow myself to mention a few examples that I hope won't bother you, or began to understand. Janios's belief that they might be uncomfortable only meant that he'd been taught not to respect himself. It indicated a dichotomous mentality that could go so far as to be ashamed of his own actions. It was obvious that only a person who has felt ashamed of what they do could think that others might feel ashamed too. Or stop listening to Janios, thinking about how to make the transformation. They had to teach him not to invalidate himself, and that would only be achieved by putting him in touch with his essence. The first example refers to a scene I observed 3 months ago. The plan was simple but difficult to carry out. He would let Janios teach him his science, and little by little he would lead him to understand. You must change what is happening. In your culture will only lead you to chaos. It will be enough for a dictator to emerge from among you, to turn you into slaves. I would create a seminar, invite Janios to teach, and the students would be him and the children. A society without laws and regulations ceases to be a society by definition. Laws prevent disorder and prevent some from taking advantage of others. I would have to talk to the children, explain to them, and they would understand. The civilization I come from has much to teach you, if only you would allow it. It would show you how to achieve absolutely objective knowledge. Despite everything you're saying, you should be able to do it. It will be very difficult and tedious, but with the help of the children, it can be done. Janios had finished. He looked at the council as if waiting for an answer. The elders looked at or with an expression of astonishment, and as if asking him if it would not be better to ask Janios to return to his wonderful civilization. Or stood up, approached Janios, and placing his arms on Janios's shoulders, turned to the elders. His gaze was sparkling, his expression smiling. The elders understood that, or had had a realization, or looked into Janios's eyes, and said in the most serious tone of voice he could muster, Tomorrow, you will start teaching us. The council was rejoicing. Janios had gone to rest, and/or was explaining to them what he would try to do. An old man began to speak. Today I realized that the lights, the tsunami, and the dead fish were the work of people similar to Janios. We understand and approve of your idea, or we only ask that you be careful. If your attempt fails, we will all be responsible, and we accept that. Or looked at the old man, thinking that the end of life was always connected to its beginning. He said to him, Han, you surprise me. A 2-year-old would have realized and understood better than you. Don't let something so simple impress you. Remember what you've learned and you'll never doubt it again." The children waited in the hut. Today they would receive their first lesson about science. While they waited for Janios, they pondered the meaning of that strange word, or had told them that they would be coming into contact with a world very different from the one they had always known, and that he had absolute confidence that they would be able to understand and manage it. Janios arrived at exactly 8 a.m. Today we'll talk about the need and importance of scientific knowledge. Science began the moment man posed a question and was able to resolve it objectively. "Do you mean," Clara asked, "that science consists of asking questions and answering them?" "What do you mean by objectively?" Clara asked. "What I want to show you," answered Janios, "is that asking and answering questions is only a means to understanding and explaining natural phenomena. Objectively means that scientific knowledge is the same for everyone." The children began to get restless. Although they remembered Or's words, they felt that Janios was very strange. Olef, the eldest of all the children, got up from his seat and, looking at Janios, said, "When someone asks questions and seeks explanations, it means they already have them. If they do this in relation to nature, they make the mistake of thinking that nature will conform to its structures and forget that these are always narrower and simpler than the knowledge they wish to acquire. If they also think that this knowledge must be the same for everyone, they fail to take into account that each of the things that make up everyone is at a different stage of the path. Wanting to teach the path thinking they can transmit it is a mistake. It makes whoever wants to teach think about teaching, stop living. The only possible teaching is that which arises from someone who is and who therefore is not interested in teaching." Janios adopted the most peaceful posture he could, and in a kind tone of voice he said to them, "Those who seek explanations don't necessarily have them in advance. They've simply posed a question and don't trust their subjectivity to answer it, so they prefer to question nature directly. The knowledge they acquire in this way may not be understood by some, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist independently of whoever understands it." Olaf insisted, "It is true that things teach, but knowledge is not in them, but in us. Distrusting what you call subjectivism is equivalent to thinking that knowledge is external and distant from ourselves. The only valid knowledge is that which is based and sustained within us, as long as we are free to know. Those who seek explanations know that they exist, and also believe they know the path to find them. Both the idea that they exist and the use of a pre-established path cause what is found to adapt to the path, which prevents obtaining new knowledge, since it is always different from the idea we have of it. Trying to know new things based on what is already known prevents achieving such knowledge. Knowledge does not exist outside or apart from the knower. Therefore, if someone does not understand a knowledge, it does not exist for them. Since they are the ones who give knowledge its value and reality, the fact that it is not part of them necessarily implies that it does not exist." Janios scratched his head before answering. This didn't please the children. They knew that the only knowledge anyone can communicate is that which comes from certainty, or had never communicated anything he doubted. He preferred not to. But here was someone who doubted, hence the scratching gesture, and yet was interested in talking. Janios sensed the children's distrust. For the first time since arriving on the island, he began to think that perhaps these people weren't as primitive as he'd imagined. He didn't quite understand the reason for this feeling, but he didn't doubt its reality either. He decided to end the meeting for that day. Janios couldn't sleep. He felt a terrible emptiness and didn't understand why. He had to analyze it and find its source, otherwise, it would only get worse, and the ultimate, he knew it, would be despair. Suddenly he understood. The feeling of emptiness had arisen at the moment they had questioned the only thing he possessed. He had to show them the value of scientific logic. Perhaps they would understand if he could find the right example. Suppose, Janius told the children the next day, that you want to know how a flower grows. The first thing you should do is understand its constituent parts. To understand them, you would need to use a method. We could dissect a flower and thus separate its components. Then we would have to take several groups of flowers and cut off a part from each one in order to determine which one produces growth. We could change the soil conditions, temperature, or humidity, and see how the flowers grow under different conditions. When we knew which parts of the flowers are essential for their growth, and determined the environmental conditions where this is optimal, we would be able to understand the growth of a flower. Clara asked, "At what point, according to science, should we experience the flower?" Janios replied that he did not understand the question. "It's very easy," said Olaf. "If we wanted to understand the growth of a flower, we should first live and love the flower." "I understand," Janios said. "The wonderful thing about the scientific method is that you don't need to have that kind of experience to understand nature, and thus answer the questions we ask." Almost in unison, the children let out an exclamation of bewilderment. "But if you haven't experienced a flower, how can you think you'll understand it? Besides, what is the point of such knowledge?" Janios began to lose patience. "What is," he asked, "the meaning of living a flower?" Luaf, the smallest of the children, began to speak. "Before I was born, you wouldn't have been able to understand me. It was necessary for me to exist, so that there would be something to understand in me. The flower you speak of, you can only know it if you first let it bloom within you. First, you have to experience the beauty of the flower, and then ask questions about it. If the flower doesn't exist within you, you can't understand it for the simple reason that understanding it also occurs within yourself." Janius's head began to hurt. He felt there was a misunderstanding somewhere, but he couldn't figure out its nature or origin. Almost pleadingly, he said to the children, "Please, let me continue, and later you'll understand what I mean. The meaning that science gives to the knowledge of nature is independent of the aesthetic sensations and emotions experienced when perceiving the object of knowledge. The two should not be confused, as this only results in a loss of objectivity." "We don't understand you," said Olaf. "For us, knowledge is an experience and that is its meaning, but for you, experience doesn't exist." "I'm not denying the experience," Janios said. "I'm just saying that the aesthetic sensation that occurs within me when I see a flower is independent of the knowledge I can acquire about it. The point of that knowledge is to satisfy my curiosity and give me the means to make flowers bigger or smaller, with or without colors, with scents or flavors, in short. Allow me to predict and control flowers or any other object around me. The ability to predict and control enables me to satisfy the needs of those who use or like the objects I know, whether they be flowers or fabrics." Olaf spoke again. "What's the point of making flowers bigger or smaller, with more or fewer colors, if you can have a more profound experience with one that already exists? What's the point of giving a flower more fragrance if at the same time you deny the importance of experiencing the fragrance? In short, what's the point of knowing without living?" "But I ask you," Janius almost shouted, "what's the point of living without knowing?" Olaf understood what was happening to Janios. With the utmost delicacy he said to him, "What happens to you is that you have never lived. If you had, you would know that knowing is only possible when you have previously lived." Janios did not answer. He looked into the void, with a guttural voice, and very quietly he said to Olaf, "Tell or to teach me how to live." Janios looked at the roof of the hut. The crossbeams that held it up seemed to have been placed by someone for whom the order of things was of no importance. "How can this happen to me?" he thought. Everything was so clear and safe, and here it is, just 2 sessions with some children. Janios moved his hands, as if painting semantic quotation marks in the air, for everything to fall apart. "The worst thing is that no one seems interested in teaching me. I've been waiting for days, and he hasn't come. I would have reacted differently. In fact, I wanted to teach them. I wanted them to be happier. But they don't think about that. They're only interested in themselves." Janios hadn't left the hut for 15 days. The food was brought to him by the children or the women. They always arrived at the door singing or laughing. They hoped Janios would notice, but he seemed to be somewhat dull-witted. The case was being discussed in the Council of Elders. Some began to doubt that Janios understood, or, on the other hand, was certain that sooner or later Janios would begin to learn about himself. He said that someone who had so quickly perceived children as possessing something different would have to come to see it in himself. Janios was desperate. He felt that everything around him was hostile, and that he was to blame for it. He closed his eyes as if trying to push away the thought of running away. He knew that if he did, he would die, but it was impossible to stop thinking about running away, cutting some branches, building a raft, and launching himself into the sea. Suddenly, he saw a lake, a full orange moon reflected on its surface. The night breeze caressed its moisture, and on its shores, small bushes and milk-colored straws moved placidly, as if enjoying the freshness of the wind and the scent of the water. The mountains surrounding the silvery surface seemed to protect it from any accident. The water, the wind, the moon, and the mountains were a single construct. They were all part of Janios, and for the first time in his life, he perceived them that way. Suddenly, a flapping of wings. A very white heron flew over the transparent water. The movement of its wings was a symphony. Janios began to sing a melody, which he realized represented flight and was beautiful, and it also came from within himself. The heron approached the surface of the lake. One wing grazed the water, creating a series of fantastic ripples that crashed against each other. Janios invented the melody of the heron in contact with the water. It was also beautiful, and represented his vision as if it were the heron himself. The heron floated in the water, its body moving with the waves, swirling or bobbing up and down with a gentle motion. The melody changed and became placid and joyful. The bird longed to dive into the liquid, took a breath, and disappeared underwater. The music became the freshness of touch. Janios could change the image and the music at will. Everything came out with unparalleled perfection, everything matched, and everything came from within. Janios opened his eyes, understood the poet, the painter, and the musician, knew that he had lived, that Olaf was right, it was living that made you learn. He understood that it was simply a matter of letting his inner self manifest itself freely, without thinking, without analyzing. This, he told himself, is the only way to know something. You must let it be born first and then understand it. If it is not born and does not exist, there is no way to understand it, because there is no possible way to understand that which does not exist. Only that which exists can be understood. Or opened the door, approached Janios and looked him straight in the eyes. Janios held the look and with a smile said to Or, "Thank you for not coming." The dialogue, the buzzing of flies, the drop of water abruptly shattering upon hitting the bottom of the sink, and the wind, every now and then the cry of some lost bird. The earth is damp and the sky is covered in deep grey. Internal silence, only attentive and concentrated listening to distant sirens, tire smacking, and lost planes. intense, suffocating fear, terror of the obvious, anguish over the obvious. Suddenly a sharp, piercing thunderclap, the shattering of heaven and earth. From the room, a newborn man was trembling. He had stripped naked and was standing by the window laughing. "I don't care if you're dramatic. You're not going to scare me. I know your anger and bad moods all too well." The response was another crash of thunder and a sudden silence from all the birds and insects. "You don't have to repeat it to me," the man replied. "The point is very clear. You want to start the fight, and I'm ready. Just don't be melodramatic." The birds began to sing again, and a soft, thick rain began to wet the plums and pears hanging from the branches. The man smiled, and with a gesture of benevolence spoke again. "I see you're in a better mood, and that satisfies me. The point, as I see it, is this. You've tried to show me that you exist outside of myself, and you think with your thunder and lightning you'll convince me. You're completely wrong. You're just a part of me. I accept that you frighten me sometimes, but you're just a scratch on my skin." The room vibrated, the clock's ticking grew louder, and the wind frantically stirred the trees. After a brief silence, the sky darkened. "Of course," the man replied. "You don't like anyone speaking to you without first bowing down to you. You're proud and primitive. You only know the language of terror and destruction. But who am I talking to? How can I converse with something that doesn't exist?" The man began to tremble again, his wide eyes waiting for an answer, and one was not long in coming. 2 trumpet blasts echoed throughout the Bronx. The man raised his arms and sitting on the ground replied, "I must destroy you. I can't stand being a part of you. I am already me, and you are included in me. You've never taught me anything. Your only response is terror, and that's something I can't stand anymore. I've learned to build by destroying, and my terror only means that there's still something inside me I haven't been able to erase." The man grabbed the woman and penetrated her violently and aggressively. He then stood up and began pacing the room. "No more desire, it's destroyed. No more modesty, it's destroyed. Now shut up once and for all." The terror disappeared. The sun pierced the clouds and the room was painted orange. "Of course," the man replied. "You thought I was going to get cold feet, that I was going to fall on my face in front of you, praying to you. Now you're defeated. There's nothing you can teach me. I build everything, and you're just a concept of mine." The storm boiled the earth. The lightning flashes blinded the man, who fell backward, covering his face. He knew he had defeated him. He tried to think about what his mistake had been, but anguish choked him. He stood up again and, beating the ground, shouted, "You're a fraud. You were never anything more than that. But you can't fool me. You have to be destroyed, and I'll see to it. I won't accept being part of you. That would destroy me, and that, I won't accept it." 2 clouds collided. The potential difference began to create a spark that spread rapidly, and the sound reached the man's ears. Frantically, he predicted, "You won't make it. Damn you!" The roar stopped abruptly. 2 birds chirped, and the buzzing of flies was heard. "You didn't scare me. I've beaten you. You're a fake idiot, son of a bitch. Disappear. Vanish. Turn into dust. I don't want to fight anymore." The woman hugged the man's legs and asked him not to continue. He took her by the shoulders and said, "As far as I'm concerned, it's over. Don't worry about it anymore." The 2 sat down to wait. Suddenly, there was a sound of movement in the kitchen. The man tensed his muscles and walked over to her. Through the window, the garden was visible. The trees and grass shone. Raindrops caught on the leaves fell to the ground, and a worm wriggled in the damp air. The man called the woman and showed her the garden and said, "Outside is the same as yesterday and tomorrow. No time has passed. It was necessary to destroy it, and it is done." The woman didn't say a word. She took the man by the hand and led him into the room. She placed his head on her chest and hugged him. The man hid his head in the woman's stomach. He whispered caresses to her and promised not to fight anymore. He felt victorious, and his fear disappeared. Suddenly, he frowned, and looking into the woman's eyes told her that, after destroying desire, sex and time, there was nothing left. At that moment, the room began to spin, the doors began to slam, and the windows began to bend. The woman began to scream, and the man stood up again and jeered loudly. "Stop playing the role, either you talk to me as an equal or you shut up, but come on, understand, I don't want to fight with you anymore." The gyrations continued, and man frantically searched his culture for something to destroy. The idea began to emerge. Love. He had to destroy love. Struggling to survive, he killed love. It was just a learning experience like any other, just part of a personal story, and therefore didn't exist. The twirl ended. The man calmed down and tried to calm his anger. He turned to a tree and said mockingly, "Your master is a hothead." And as soon as someone tells him things clearly, he's ashamed of his manners. The man had understood that he had to destroy everything inside him. That was the only way to win, because the fight would continue. He destroyed his family, his country, his world, his time, his power, his sex, his love, and suddenly he happened to hear music. He looked for Beethoven's Seventh, and lying between two speakers, he listened. Fear reappeared, turning into terror and then anguish. Beethoven was depicting a struggle, and in the passages where his God defeated him, his fear was transmitted. The man smashed the records, and weeping, destroyed the music as well. Nothing remained but the sensation of continuing to exist and to be. The thunder reappeared, and the man, desperate, complained, "Now what do you want, you devilish demon? I have destroyed everything, I have nothing left but myself, and I will not kill that, even if you thunder and vomit blood. Stop fighting me. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I despise you. I curse you. Vanish." The trumpets sounded. The man lay back and, curling into a fetal position, began to weep silently. "I have nothing left. I'm empty, and all for accepting the struggle. I want it to end. I can't stand it anymore." A scream rang out in the darkness. Someone had died, and the man heard his farewell. He couldn't believe it. It was too much. "Why did you do that? Who are you to end the life of a god? I repeat, I will not destroy myself by making you my worship. But you know, I accept your existence and I accept mine. I will not try to become you, but you will not become me either." The earth rested. Time began to move again, and the birds began to sing. The woman looked at the man with eyes of terror, and he looked at himself in silence. He had accepted the existence of God, and at the same time the existence of man as God. The dialogue had begun. The organist, dark, and a person standing by the door collecting the entrance fee. Noise, hellish noise of organ, electric guitar, saxophone and drums. Dark tables and dark chairs. In the background, a platform illuminated with red reflections of cigarette smoke. I approach the bar and notice with surprise that the spot closest to the set is empty. I think it's meant for me and sit down. Suddenly, I notice the organist, a huge fat black man with a shaved head and dark beard against a backdrop of rings, necklaces and earrings. His face is a fire of sudden isochronous contractions. His eyes close every time he plays a low note. The guitarist hides behind him, anonymous, leaning against one of his speakers, his face bored and his eyes idiotic. The saxophonist is visible but not visible, just an empty body. The music is strange, and the musicians even more so. I tire of looking at them and look toward a table. As always, a woman. But this one is reminiscent of Greece. Completely motionless and beautiful, she remains listening to the music. Occasionally she smiles and nods. I can't stop staring at her and being amazed by her calm, her beauty, and her connection and understanding with her surroundings. The band has stopped playing. The organist smokes a cigarette and drinks from a bottle. Suddenly he stops drinking and busies himself tuning his instrument. He touches one button and then another, and the low tones produced seem to displease him. He tries again. He changes the position of 3 switches and repeats the previous notes. A low, wavering wail is heard, and a puzzled expression appears on his face. He puts out his cigarette and plays the same notes again. It's an interesting theme, I think. I hope he continues with it. The organist seems to agree with me, as he begins to develop the theme he has discovered. The notes rise and fall, the low tones intermingle, producing the most complex arabesques. The guitarist, who until this moment had remained motionless and staring into space, begins to take an interest in the new music and, to demonstrate, begins to play. The original theme is still in the organist's possession. The relationship of notes seems to be so powerful that his face enters into a burst of paroxysmal contractions, which, reaching a climax, dissipate in a spasmodic sweep of the keyboard. The guitarist begins a dialogue with an imaginary being. His mouth and eyes awaken, and after a brief silence, he begins to develop a new theme. His music is of high tones that dance in voluptuous scales until they become a continuous and desperate change. The organist does not yield to the invitation. He maintains the original theme and at times seems annoyed by the appearance of this new and original development. The saxophonist, who until then had been accompanying the organist, takes an interest in the guitarist. At first he makes a timid attempt in the direction of higher tones, but then changes his mind and continues with the organist. The latter maintains a clear competition with the guitarist. Both defend their themes and fail to reach an agreement. Suddenly, the saxophonist makes a decision, reinforces his higher tones, and adopts the guitarist's theme. The two develop the same level of communication, which reaches very intense levels. The changes occur with increasing rapidity, and what was initially a clear and transparent sequence of sounds now acquires a force and power that makes it seem disorganized and random. The organist seems to be very worried, and thinks the music he hears is a manifestation of degeneration. He tells his colleagues. The tones that come out of the organ in response are of such intensity and frequency that they are almost audible. The organist repeats the message but realizes that it doesn't interest the other musicians. They find themselves lost in a universe of sounds, and the only thing that interests them is that these sounds do not disappear. The organist knows what is happening to them and tries to make them come back. He realizes that they are about to lose their body and begins to tell them not to do it, that there is nothing more complex to handle, and that with something simpler they will feel bored. At that moment, the drummer starts playing. It's like a pacifying signal. Both contenders stop competing and rest. The drummer's sounds are a question mark, posing the competition between the organist and the guitarist as absurd and questioning its validity. The organist understands the message and decides to change his attitude. He tells the guitarist, who accepts the change. The organist continues playing, asking for calm and understanding. He tells the guitarist that to get where he wants to go, music isn't enough. He also needs to maintain a certain amount of discipline, enough to avoid falling into an abyss. The guitarist accepts the message, and everyone joins in on the original theme, thus completing the composition. I order a drink. While I savor it, I reconstruct the music and the dialogue that has unfolded before my eyes. I think the power of music and its ability to convey messages is extraordinary. It makes me want to dedicate myself to it and thus experience its magic and power firsthand. There's no doubt that these musicians are talking to each other, arguing and dialoguing. I don't understand the content of their messages. I'm only able to see their manifestations and the intricate and extremely complex operations that produce them. It's the same sensation as walking down the street in an unfamiliar city. The people you see are actors and characters manifesting life and interaction, but the content of this interaction can't be heard, and it can't be heard because at that level it doesn't matter. The night is warm, and I thank Sam for driving me home. He chooses the route along the river. The sight of the lights reflecting on its surface is so comforting that it invites a quiet conversation. Sam talks about the origin of that music. It began, he says, when someone was brave enough to break away from all fixed and strict rules, when they were able to consider themselves the decider and master of their own musical messages. This, he repeats, was the beginning of such music. The extraordinary thing happened when dozens of artists understood the message and joined in. At that moment, music ceased to be a game and became a free manifestation of internal universes. You're right, I said. What used to be submission to authoritarian forms and laws broke down, and from there emerged an entire musical movement that tends to free music from its origins, turning it into a free manifestation of emotions, sensations, and even states of knowledge. If this path has continued, the music we've just heard must be at the forefront of these musicians' development, and, as such, represent a new creation, not a reminiscence of past learning. Whatever they are, I continued, these musicians must be very happy. Sam laughed. I agree in principle with what you're saying, he admitted. But I don't think they remain in a constant state of happiness. If they were, their music would be very boring. Rather, he continued, they talk about what has happened to them, sometimes about injustice, racial discrimination, despair and pain, other times about love, desire, religion. What they've certainly developed is an astonishing capacity to manifest and communicate all those experiences. So, their music, I said, frightened, is so close to themselves that it reaches the highest levels of complexity. No, Sam corrected me, it's still too simple. The man, listen, he said forcefully but with a smile, when I speak to someone, I am the subject, and they are the object. When someone speaks to me, they are the subject, and I am the object. The object and the subject are me or them. When I speak to them or to me, there is neither subject nor object. And the most indisputable proof of this is that I myself can be the object of myself, while being myself a subject, or I can believe myself to be a subject, while being only an object. When someone understands, they know that the true state of consciousness is that in which the object and the subject disappear. The room was covered with carpets. Spread across them were dozens of barefoot men and women in the lotus position. The interpreter approached the large white armchair, in which a dark-skinned man with gold-plated glasses and silver-toned hair was sitting. The second question was translated. The man laughed before answering, smoothed his grey beard and said, after the moment when you realize that nothing is a coincidence, two things can happen. First is to stop searching and begin to savor the particular cases that teach and clarify connections. The second is to continue searching for what, because it is a search, cannot be found. A woman gestured with her hands, brought them up to her face, placed one on each cheek, and swayed her head from side to side. The man looked at the woman and asked her what was wrong. She approached him and, prostrating herself before him, told him through the interpreter that she didn't understand why the one she was searching for couldn't find her. The reason is simple, he explained. The person who searches thinks he knows what he wants to find, and when he doesn't find it, he assumes he can't find it, and keeps searching. Everything around him responds, but he's not even capable of hearing that response. So deafened is he by the other response, the one he expects to hear. Once the interpreter translated the answer, the woman smiled as if she understood, but asked again what she expected to hear. The man took pity on her, and with a tremendous effort answered. What one expects to hear is what one recognizes as the object of the search, what one believes one will find when one finds it. The woman smiled again. The man looked her straight in the eyes and took pity on her again. He indicated a spot on the carpet and asked her to stop talking and listen. The interpreter translated again. From the man's gestures, it was clear that the question he had just asked was simple. When I look at another person's forehead, I perceive a light emanating from its center. When I look into his eyes, the light changes color and takes on fantastic shapes. A machine, no matter how complex, can achieve that. But we are machines too, someone said. The interpreter heard the comment on the man's response and told him. Smiling, the man said, "You're right. When I see light, I act like a super-sensitive machine. Although I must tell you that when I see what I see, and I also know that I do it. If your machine can do it too, tell it I want to talk to it." The room erupted in laughter. The person who had asked the question stood up, and after honoring the man with a nod, sat down again. The man ordered the lights to be turned off, and began to sing in a deep, melancholic tone. He who thinks of sensible objects clings to them. By clinging, he creates illusions. Illusions engender rage. Rage causes the loss of memory. The loss of memory destroys reason. When reason disappears, destruction ensues. As he finished, he fell silent, and then there was silence. Only silence.